Hello, everybody, and welcome to Seattle, Washington. We are here at Westland Distillery, where we make American single malt whiskey. My name is Matt Hofmann, and I am the co-founder here at Westland. And today, we're going to take you on a tour because we couldn't be there with you in person this year in the UK, but fortunately, we get to show you how everything is made. So now we're back here on the actual production side of the distillery. And as you can see, this is not a fake distillery. We are in fact making quite a bit of whiskey active production site here. One of the really exciting things we're working on right now, this is actually peated malt from Washington State Peat, a project we've been working on for almost 5 years. But our whole genesis here at Westland, the whole idea behind Westland is to do something that is evocative of place. The Pacific Northwest is one of the best places to make single malt whiskey in the world because it is one of the best barley growing climates in the world. But we also have things like Washington State Peat. We also have our own local species of oak that we use to make barrels called Quercus garryana. So what we're going to do today is we're going to show you not just some of the things that, some of the equipment of how we make the whiskey itself, but also talk a little bit about our philosophy. So here at Westland Distillery, we make nothing but American single malt whiskey. And as I said before, that's because Washington State, the Pacific Northwest, is one of the best places to grow barley in the world. However, the way that we do that, we've got a few different approaches. The one that really started it all for us was a focus on flavor in barley inspired by the brewing industry. The craft brewing revolution started here in the Pacific Northwest, and the way that they look at barley is very different compared to the way the traditional whiskey industry does. So we use a recipe of these 5 different types of malted barleys right here that would basically be normally used to make something like a porter. By mashing all 5 of these together, we get this kind of beautiful spectrum of flavor from pale biscuity malt notes to chocolate and pecan and hazelnuts, leather, tobacco, all sorts of really interesting notes by using roasted malts. So this is the foundation for everything that we do. Since then, we have built on it by using peated malts. We've been sourcing that from Baird's in Scotland, but now we are increasingly using peated malt from Washington State Peat here. That's exactly what this is right here, using local peat. Been a really exciting project for us. And the other big thing that we're doing now is focusing on barley varietals. So not the roast levels themselves, but the different varietals of barley. So for example, this is a 6-row variety of barley called Alba. This is a new varietal barley. It's never been used before in the whiskey industry in Scotland or the US. But we've also got really exciting things like this. This is a black barley varietal. This is its natural color, not roasted. So there's all sorts of really interesting things that we're pursuing here. We've used 20 plus different varietals of barley, which is more varietals of barley than the entire Scottish whiskey industry put together, if you can imagine that. So barley is our big focus here at Westland. We built everything else on top of that. So when you go on a tour of a distillery in Scotland, a lot of times they want to show you the old Porteous mill or the old Bowbin mill, and they're beautiful. But we're not in Scotland, we're here in Seattle. And the thing to understand about Westland is we're not trying to pretend that we're Scottish. You know, we're not trying to pretend that we are this legacy of the Scottish whiskey industry. We respect the history and tradition that does exist there, but we're building on it, creating something new. We're not afraid of using new equipment and new techniques. So we've got here a 4-roller mill, very much like what you would see in the Scottish whiskey industry, but made right here in America. So we're headed now from the mill room over here into the mash room. And here is where we're doing our mashing process 7 days a week. We're using about an acre's worth of barley every day, just shy of 3 tons of barley. So up here we have a system that very much looks like a conventional craft brewing system that you'd find here in the Pacific Northwest. And that's because most builders of equipment around here are builders of craft brewing systems. So we've got a lot of the same technology, a lot of the same aesthetics. Looks very different compared to a distillery in Scotland. So here we are up here now on the mash platform, and here we do 2 batches per day, 7 days a week. Each mash is 50 hectoliter outputs that'll go to the fermenter. So we'll do 2 of those to fill one 100 hectoliter fermenter per day. So in here we've got a isothermal mash tun with rakes rotating really slowly. A mash here takes about 5 to 6 hours start to finish, which is relatively quick compared to some of the older mash tuns you might see in Scotland, but not as hyper quick as some of the stuff you see at the most advanced distilleries. This is still operated all by human control. So everybody's setting the pump speeds, everybody's turning dials, things like that. So 2 of these mashes a day. We're doing a 3-water system like you see at a lot of distilleries. The 3rd water here most of the time is about 77 to 80 degrees Celsius, which is producing a lighter, more delicate type of spirit that will be produced off of the still. Although sometimes we change our mashing technique to vary up the flavor, extracting more oils from the grain. So there's a lot of things that we do here on the mashing side that actually give us more options and complexity in the final whiskeys that we can blend from. So now we're down in the fermentation room with our fermentation vessels here, and this is going to look really different compared to what you would see in Scotland. In Scotland, most distilleries are using what they call Oregon pine washbacks, which actually grow here in the Pacific Northwest. But we took a lot of cues from the craft brewing industry. And in the beer industry, they're using temperature-controlled stainless steel fermentation tanks. So not just stainless steel as a material, but using temperature control to make sure the temperature in the fermentation doesn't get too high. Now, why do we do that? Well, the big thing is that we are using a different yeast strain compared to most distilleries in Scotland. In fact, all distilleries in Scotland. Most distilleries are using the M strain in Scotland and other places around the world. We use a strain of Belgian Saison brewer's yeast, a farmhouse ale yeast, really close to a wild ale yeast. Produces a ton of flavor, but we don't want it to get too hot because then it'll produce too many off flavors. So we have glycol chilled fermentation vessels here, which cap the fermentation temperature at 27 degrees Celsius, but give us a nice, beautiful fermentation from that Belgian Saison yeast. So now we're here in our still room. So we have 2 stills. Right behind me is the wash still and our spirit still here. So most of what we're doing is a traditional double distillation process. You would see basically in every distillery in Scotland. There's a couple of variations on it that are inspired by or are similar to distilleries like Mortlach or Springbank. But for the most part, most of the stuff that we do is traditional double distillation. These are not 4-size stills. These are not what you see in a lot of distilleries in Scotland. These are built by Vendome Copper and Brass out of Louisville, Kentucky. But the functionality is still basically the same. We've got a spirit safe here. We don't need to have a spirit safe, but we loved the history of that, so we have an American version of that built here. So very simply, distilling here twice a day on the wash still to empty 1 fermentation vessel, producing enough low wines, recycling the tails back to distill in the spirit still 1 of those per day. And we're pulling samples out from right here. And we actually do all of our cuts based on nose. We don't do it by time or temperature or any other metric, always done by nose. And the reason for that is because of the Belgian Saison yeast produces so much flavor, we have to be very, very particular about exactly what we want. So we're taking samples here, diverting everything to our tanks, heads, hearts, and tails, and we produce about 1,000 liters of barreled spirit every day of the week. So here at Westland, we fill a variety of cask types, many of which are very uncommon or not seen in the single malt whiskey industry anywhere around the world. The big one and the real workhorse of our whiskey production philosophy here is New American White Oak. So New American White Oak, of course, used for the bourbon industry, required for the bourbon industry, but not commonly seen in the Scottish single malt business. Now, we're making an American single malt. We thought it was very important for us to mature whiskey inside of New American Oak casks. But just as important as using New American Oak casks itself is the quality of oak that we use. We only use slow-grown oak, so it has very tight rings. which actually maybe counterintuitively means more porosity, more oxygen exchange with the atmosphere. We also air dry the wood for a minimum of 18 to 24 months for our new American white oak. And that breaks down the tannins in the wood. So that means we get a very soft expression of oak. Even though we're using new oak, it's not overpowering, neither in the aroma or in the palate. You don't get a lot of that bitterness. So this is about 40% of what we fill here at Westland. We also fill a variety of ex-bourbon casks like you'd see in a lot of distilleries in Scotland. We fill some sherry casks, traditional sherry casks that come over from southern Spain. Those are averaging between 60 and 80 years old when we fill them, so they're the real traditional types. But we're also filling a variety of casks that are influenced here in the Pacific Northwest. And the big one, of course, for people who are fans of Westland today, is the Gariana casks. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we have our own species of white oak called Quercus gariana. And Gariana casks are made with this oak exclusively. It's very rare. You can't cut these trees down. It's so expensive to make and to use. But we get this incredible flavor from it. And it's one of only 5 varieties of white oak that are being used in the world of whiskey. So it's a really exciting project for us, and it's one that really helps us dive down into making a Pacific Northwest American single malt. Now, all the casks we fill, except for these ones that you see right here behind me, we're here at the distillery. These are only 100 out of the more than 8,000 casks that we have filled here at Westland. Almost all of the rest are off-site and maturing in non-temperature controlled environments. So we don't change the heat or the humidity at all. We want the Washington State footprint to be just as much a part of the whiskey, if not more, than us as individuals. The climate here is pretty similar to Scotland. We have a very temperate climate here, none of the big temperature swings like you'd see in Kentucky. So it's relatively warm summers, but it very rarely snows here. So we have this nice balanced aging environment, and we don't interfere with that at all. As well, we don't do any maturation tricks. We don't do any small barrels. We don't do any oak chips, oak spirals, none of that stuff. It's traditional, full-size 200-liter casks or larger hogsheads and butts as well. So from a maturation kind of philosophy, we're pretty conservative and we're very traditional. So thank you everybody for coming on this tour here with us today. Now, obviously we would have loved to have been there in person with you in the UK, but on the flip side, this has given us an opportunity to show you around our facility and show you how we make whiskey. So we appreciate you taking the time. If you have any questions at all, we're completely transparent. In fact, an intellectual property attorney who came on a tour with us once said we were alarmingly transparent. So you can ask whatever questions you want. We'll tell you whatever you'd like to know. And cheers to all of you, and we look forward to discussing with you in the future. Thanks, everybody.